You're watching GTV, Cable Channel 70.
Years ago, if you mentioned the words Katrina, September 11th, or avian flu, people wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about. Sure, there were disasters, emergencies, and first responders, but the national focus on disasters and terrorism was minimal at best. We've learned the hard way that emergency managers are a critical piece of our community safety net. Whether it's the police, fire and rescue, citizen services, or health, these men and women are on the front lines, protecting our families in the face of potential danger. An effective response to natural or man-made disasters relies on communications. Unless our first responders can communicate with one another, a coordinated response may be jeopardized. And for many issues, it's essential that the public also be in the communications loop. While emergency communications are needed in a disaster, they're also needed in smaller scale emergencies. Crises come in many forms. The quality of communication can mean survival or not for victims. What are the emergency communication systems that protect Howard County residents? How are these systems used in times of emergency? And how can your family stay in communication during a major community crisis? Hi, I'm Rich Krieg, host of On the Horizon, and with me in the studio today are Captain Ryan Miller, Howard County Fire and Rescue, Major Bill McMahon, Howard County Department of Police, and Andrew Ingram, Executive Director of Grassroots. I probably should have said General because we were going up on rank as we went down the table. Bill, let me start with you. I'm interested in hearing your take on how things have changed in the police department since 9/11.
I think there's been, within the police department specifically, we've done a lot more in terms of training our folks in this whole terrorism world. I mean, this really has added another layer of responsibility on the police department. I think one thing that became clear in 2001 after that tragedy was that this is a local problem. That, I think in the past we kind of thought about terrorism as over there in a foreign country. The national government, the federal government would have the response, they had the responsibility. And I think it became very clear that you really, at least for the first several days, this is truly an emergency that the local community, the local first responders, local government is really going to have to respond to. So we really had to train our people up on that in terms of prevention, in terms of response. We've done a lot of, taken advantage of a lot of grants, and we've purchased a lot of equipment. And when we buy that equipment, we do try to buy things that do have that capability for the terrorism world, but also have some everyday applications, so we really get everyday use out of the money we're spending, and I think that's helpful. I guess in the broader context of the county, first responders with Ryan and the folks on the fire side, I guess two levels. One is a lot more interaction, a lot more pre-planning together, a lot more response capability together, and again, the whole equipment acquisition. In the past, we certainly, on minor calls, ambulance collisions, medical calls, we would work closely together. Snow events, we'd work closely together. But now we meet monthly. The department heads, and then the second or third tier, like myself and Ryan, we meet at least monthly, planning our responses for events. So that today is not the first time I met Ryan. I know who Ryan is. He knows who I am. So when an emergency does hit, and we're ready to roll. And that has, although it's not terrorism, that certainly was evident after 9/11 with the sniper, which had an impact here in Howard County, with the President's Day snowstorm a couple years back, and Hurricane Isabel. So it's really an all-hazards approach. But our preparation, in light of what happened in 9/11, has really made us, I think, better prepared to handle a host of emergencies in the county.
Great answer, and I think, Ryan, what Bill's talking about is really community readiness. If you drill down into what are the components of community readiness, what would you say to that?
Well, community readiness specifically, obviously we are part of the community, the responders and the agencies that would assist us during an emergency. So I would say one would be just all personnel and resources that would be involved in responding to an emergency or a disaster. So that's certainly part of it. Within that, just like the Major mentioned, would be just the resources that those responders would utilize. So that's kind of one component, which would just be ready resources and ready personnel. Another component of that is plans and procedures that are prescribed. Obviously, we can't plan for all emergencies or can't think through all contingencies, but we certainly can have some of the planning components prescribed. And that's one thing about plans that that we feel really strongly about, is that plans are they're something to get you started. They certainly they don't walk you through all phases of an emergency, but they sort of get you started. And two, that planning and procedures, they have to be realistic. They have to be realistic and they have to be flexible. So one thing that I think we've taken really seriously in the county is very pragmatic planning, very practical planning, planning that's not done in isolation, that's not done by one person. Some of the meetings that the Major spoke of can be pretty lengthy as we hash through all the details, but those rootsy homegrown plans oftentimes are some of the best. And then lastly is just the ready public. That's a very difficult thing for us to achieve. It's pretty difficult to measure, quite frankly. We've taken some steps in that area, though, through some outreach programs. One of them would be the ASSERT program, which is a community emergency response team program. Another that Ms. Ingram is involved with is called Neighbor to Neighbor, and it actually is sort of a door-to-door, if you will, approach within an isolated community to make sure that you know your neighbors and that you know what the needs are in the community, that you've kind of just approached the topic as a community, that hey, if something were to happen, and as the government has said, we could be potentially on our own for 72 hours, how is it that we would deal with that as a community? And those events a lot of times are they're pretty low-key, kind of informal neighborhood gatherings, but they've been very effective in just, if nothing else, getting people to talk about those concepts.
And I understand, thank you, Ryan, that you actually have done one of those neighbor-to-neighbor programs several times in your house. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Well, I was really motivated to sort of launch, along with others, that Neighbor to Neighbor, because it just so happens in our neighborhood, for whatever reason, we've had situations where we've lost power for significant periods of time. And I haven't really seen in those occasions our neighbors coming together to help each other too much. So then, after 9/11 and getting involved in the Community Emergency Response Network, Neighbor to Neighbor really came up as a way to really address the community readiness. And when you really get right down to it, your local community, your neighborhood, your immediate neighbors, they may be the group that really has to survive together, rely on each other. So we launched that in our neighborhood as a pilot program, and Ann Town launched one in her neighborhood as well. We determined...
For those who don't know her, Ann Town, the Executive Director of the Association of Community Services. Go ahead. We
had slightly different kinds of neighborhoods, but the first thing we do is have to determine exactly what are the boundaries of our neighborhood. So we sort of looked at the roads and so forth and came up with a boundary that included about 60 homes, and went around and gave flyers to people and invited them to our home and invited people to complete a survey. Totally voluntary, of course, so that we could see what kinds of skills we had in our neighborhood, what resources we have in our neighborhood, and also if there are neighbors that have special needs that we don't know about, that might need for some neighbor to go and check on them and see if they were okay or needed anything special during some kind of an emergency. So we've had quite a few meetings now. About 30 of our neighbors, about half of the neighbors in the 60 household area are participating. And since then, it's launched even a little bit beyond that to, we're in the Hammond area, to the Hammond Village Association, which is looking to get more folks trained. We've had a few of our people in the CERN training. And so we're launching into sort of a bigger neighborhood, a village level neighbor. So we're just, keep working at it and seeing where it takes us.
Well, that's just wonderful. And it's clear to me that from the public sector, it would seem that a community like Andrews that had done that prior work would probably have a better survival chance, have more resilience than a community that may not have done that. So it's really an interesting program, and we'll get back to that. Now, last year when Chief Herr was on the program, Joe Herr, the Chief of Fire and Rescue, he talked about the Emergency Operations Center. And he's up there under the county executive in a managerial capacity, Ryan. And if you've got Andrea's community down here, and you've got the Emergency Operations Center during a disaster or a major crisis in the community, you've got to communicate. Critical aspect of what happens. If you will, talk about such things as what's a warning,
Okay.
at the most basic level, and how do you think about that communication, that spectrum of communications that would happen with the community during a crisis?
Okay. Specifically, you mentioned the Emergency Operations Center. What that is essentially during an emergency, all leaders of public safety, public health, public works, police, fire, they all assemble at one place, and they basically take the direction from the county executive. And they're coordinating resources, coordinating responses, coordinating personnel from what we call the EOC. You were talking about kind of how do we link to the public, and that's a great question. I think one thing that was very evident in our meeting, I was fortunate enough to sit in on one of their community meetings in the Hammond area, was if ahead of time you can actually talk about sort of what to expect, you're sort of managing some of the expectations. So I think what you find is folks aren't really clamoring for information quite so quickly during an emergency. So that's something we've tried to front load some of the preparedness and some of the information so that people know what to expect. But beyond that, you asked specifically about alerting and warning. Those are two things that we have kind of taken to heart as we've developed some of our systems over the last couple of years. But basically, alerting is just getting folks' attention that there's something going on, there's an emergency. And warning is delivering the information behind that attention-getting mechanism. So basically, during an emergency, part of that EOC operation includes the public information officer for the county, who marshals the resources of the respective public information offices within the response agencies, such as police and fire, public health as well. Sort of anybody that would be involved in the response portion.
And here you're talking about Victoria Goodman, who does a fabulous job in that area.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Right. So Ms. Goodman, Ms. Goodman's office would develop sort of a cohesive information package that would go out to the public that represents kind of the same message, which is critical during an emergency, that everyone is delivering the same message. So that would be one thing that the public could expect, would be messaging from the Public Information Office. How that occurs is a couple different ways. One system that we've developed over the last 2 years, right now we've kind of been using it in isolated emergencies. It's not a great message tool for countywide emergency, but it works really well for isolated areas, and that's the community notification system. Essentially, it's a 32 phone line system that can make calls, about 1 call per second, delivering an emergency message. The nice thing about that is, used in tandem with another system that we're working on now, should be operational this fall, is an AM radio system, which in conjunction, the community notification system could be used to alert the public, as well crawlers at the bottom of the screen, part of the emergency broadcast system, NOAA weather radios. Those things could get folks' attention that there is an emergency. And then we anticipate the AM radio system to be a venue that folks can tune to get Howard County specific information. And again, that information would come from the Public Information Office.
Wonderful. And Bill, within the public sector, of course, you have your own internal communications. And I've heard mention of the 800 megahertz system. Sure. That sort of is the backbone. I know that the Department of Police, in very real situations, has been exposed to non-interoperability in surrounding jurisdictions. That might be a few years back.
Sure.
But talk, if you will, about that need to have standardized systems so that public sector officials can communicate in the most efficient and effective way possible.
Sure. I mean, we're not an island here in Harris County, and you know, we really are part of two very active regions, the Washington region, the Baltimore region, and we're somewhere geographically, we're somewhere in between, and kind of psychologically, we're somewhere in between. And our ability to communicate with those different jurisdictions is critical. I mentioned earlier the sniper incident. Although we never had a sniper shooting in the county, as the bird flies, probably about 8 or 9 miles was where the series of shootings began from our border, and we know in retrospect these folks had come through our county and things like that. So when we're trying, so we have a lot of our plans are based on a regional concept. We know that if a long-standing event or a long-lasting event in the county may exhaust all of our immediate resources here in the county, and we're going to be reaching into Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County, Baltimore County, Little City, and the ability to communicate seamlessly with those folks is critical. And harken back to the older days when I was doing real police work, you would literally have to either have somebody else from another agency standing next to you, or they'd give you your radio, and you'd be carrying 2 or 3 radios around talking to people. Now, with most of the jurisdictions in the region going to an 800 megahertz system, it gives us the ability to pretty seamlessly, with flicking a couple buttons, be able to talk to our neighbors in other jurisdictions. And it's not just on the major events. It can also be a little more instantaneous in terms of, we have a police pursuit, for example. We're chasing an armed robber and he's not stopping, he's approaching Montgomery County. We can work with Montgomery County and be talking to their dispatcher, their police officers. In the past, we'd have to call, talk to our dispatcher, who would then by phone talk to Montgomery County's dispatcher, who by radio would talk to their officer. And so obviously the communication loop took a little bit longer, and that time is critical. And it's more than just regional. I mean, this 800 system, when fully implemented, will be national. If an officer for some reason is riding through is from Nebraska and is riding down 95 on his way to training and sees something, he should have an option on his radio to talk to our dispatcher directly. So it's critical.
I thought about that. Now, Andrea, in the nonprofit sector, I'd like you to give a little bit of background on Grassroots for those who may not know about the operation, but end up, if you could, on the 24-hour hotline, because I want to see if we could connect that to the previous discussion.
Well, Grassroots operates the county shelter programs. We have a family shelter and a men's shelter. We put families in motel. We provide comprehensive services to help people permanently resolve their homeless situation. But more relevant to what we're talking about today, Grassroots provides a variety of 24-hour crisis services, including several hotlines that we answer. People can come into Grassroots anytime, 24 hours, and see a counselor for walk-in crisis counseling. We've had the mobile crisis team now for about 4 years. We work with the police department. We have a 2-member team, master's level mental health clinicians who respond with the police to psychiatric emergencies, family crisis in the community. And we're also now participating with the Mental Health Authority on the disaster mental health response team. Did you want me to go into that now?
Please go into that.
Okay.
Yeah.
This was, again, part of the Community Emergency Response Network. One of the initiatives there was to develop a mental health disaster response. I think mental health is often sort of the last thing people think about, and yet when there's a mass disaster, an event like 9/11 or the Hurricane Katrina, I mean, I think we're learning that just about everybody is affected, and people are traumatized to varying degrees. And if you have a mental health response, what you can do is really, for the future, it's a prevention approach, really, so that people are not on a long-term basis traumatized in a way that really impacts their functioning and their ability to get on. Some people will be more affected than others, say folks who may have a mental illness to begin with, and then this kind of stress and trauma on top of that, they may need some special attention. So what we've done in Howard County is develop, right now we have about a 40-member mental health disaster response team. It's coordinated by the Mental Health Authority. We meet quarterly. We have training opportunities for people. We have a network established of communication and how we would reach people in the event that we needed their assistance. We've had a few practice events where we try to see, how we get a response from people. We have an email response network as well as a telephone response. So, we think we're pretty well on our way to being ready to be able to participate in a countywide response.
That's terrific. And as you listen to all of this out there, it may seem a little complicated. And one thing that pulls it together is what you call the incident command system, incident command thinking. And Bill, I wonder if you could say some words about what that process is. I'm going to ask the same question to Ryan, but when you think of incident command, how could you get that across in English so that people understand how you mobilize at the time of an emergency?
Sure. I think that in the fire department is about 20 years ahead of the police departments nationally in using incident command system. But I think the easiest way for folks with that type of background, I think, is project management. Mm-hmm. It's really identifying key things that need to be done, assigning responsibility to an individual to be responsible for that, and setting up a structure for which we're only talking to one individual. So if I'm in charge of the incident and I need traffic direction done, I talk to Ryan and say, Ryan, I want you to handle all the traffic direction. And then in his little world, he does the same thing. He sets down, okay, this street needs this street, this street. But I'm only talking to him. And if I also need somebody to do some outreach to the community, I talk to Andrea. I say, Andrea, you're responsible for all that. So it's really just a way of breaking down what can be a very, very, very complex situation, breaking it down to manageable tasks, assigning responsibility for it, and making sure that those lines of authority, those lines of communication are clear so that everybody knows that perhaps I'm in charge. I know that all my traffic issues are related to Ryan, all my community outreach are to you, and maybe you're in charge of investigations. So everybody kind of knows what everybody else's responsibility is, and it really, really cuts down that confusion. And then there's also kind of a second level of unified command where if it's an incident that involves police, fire, public works, that the agency that's in charge may change over the course of the incident. So for example, if it's an explosion, for example, it might first be the fire department's responsibility in terms of taking care of those life safety things. And when that's kind of stabilized, then it may become a police department for the next 24, 48 hours for investigation, and maybe ultimately it's a Department of Public Works incident for cleanup. So that who's in charge and who has the primary responsibility may change, but it's coordinated. The worst thing you can have is have 27 bosses show up, all claiming to be in charge, all really legitimately having a role, but those roles not clearly distinguished.
So what I'm hearing from Bill Ryan is a clear command structure, but also lots of flexibility.
Sure. In fact, that's sort of the reason the incident command system was born. It was born on the West Coast because of the large wildfires. It's where it got its start. And a fire starts small. Sometimes they grow large. And the idea there was that you could quickly scale, from one fire engine to quickly hundreds of fire apparatus and hundreds of firefighters without reworking the structure. It basically, they call it scalable. It's scalable, it can grow and also collapse given the size or complexity of the emergency. One thing that we find is interesting is we go out and present the incident command system or incident command training. So people often say, wow, this is really simple. I thought it was really complicated. Well, the reason it's simple is because it really is intuitive. Like the Major said, it is sort of good project management. The way it's laid out essentially is there's typically one person ultimately in charge, with the exception of the unified command scenario. And beneath that, there's operations, there's planning, there's logistics, and then there's finance and administration. Those four components are, for the most part, present in all emergencies. And the way that works is the operations folks, those are the ones really doing the work. Planning, they're looking ahead, seeing what's next, what the next needs are going to be. Logistics responsibility is to go get those things, and then admin and finance, they're responsible for paying for them. We've even heard the analogy of a wedding used before. You could pretty much identify who's responsible for each of those roles. So it really is a very intuitive system, and it works well.
Yeah, and when you talk about Joint Command, you even got a mobile command post in light of communications that can actually make that EOC move depending on the contingency. And that, I believe that's in Fire and Rescue, that you have that vehicle.
It's actually a partnership with the police department. It's housed, mainly because we have a good location to store it, but it's housed within a fire station. But the police department has equal access to the unit as does fire. The operator most likely would be somebody from our fire station, for which it's housed. But it's configured such that it could be used for the police and also for the fire department. And oftentimes, when it goes out on an emergency, oftentimes it is a unified command scenario where you'll find both police, fire, public works, multiple agencies working out of the command post.
And I will tell you, and I'm not exaggerating the situation, I had the privilege really as a citizen to observe something called Community Readiness Week that utilized that vehicle. I saw your leadership firsthand. I'm not trying to brand you up, Bill, but I was right there when you were addressing the officers and saw the men and women of fire and rescue, police, health really respond to a critical scenario. That it was a it was a mock drill, but it's really something to watch you guys in action. Really heartwarming to see that. I wanted to spin over here because we got about 3 minutes left now, and Bill mentioned earlier, and Ryan mentioned the equipment, the advent of equipment from the federal government. You're in the nonprofit sector, and oftentimes nonprofits have to raise their funds, and you are now involved in building the infrastructure of the Grassroots Crisis Center in terms of a new building and new resources. I'd like you to talk about that because I think the community needs to hear it.
Okay. This is a project we've been working on for about 8 years, and it's evolved to our current plan, which is to demolish the building that we occupy right now on Freetown Road, and we will be putting up a 2-story facility in its place. It will vastly increase our shelter capacity. That really was one of the real crises that got us started on this, is the demand for shelter that we just did not have the capacity to respond to. So it will increase our ability to provide shelter to families and to individuals in Howard County. And it will allow us to have much improved space and equipment and so forth to be able to enhance our 24-hour crisis services. Right now, there's so many things that are happening in this small building that we occupy, and we're just bursting at the seams. So this is really something it's not being done for us. This is being done for Howard County. I mean, this will ultimately just be a fabulous service for Howard County, and it's not just for homeless individuals. That's the part of what we do with the shelter programs, but the crisis services are really an integral part of the whole crisis response that is there for any citizen in Howard County.
And I know you're raising the dollars. It's substantial, and I want to for the business community, for corporations, for private donors, for families who want to contribute. How is it that they can get those contributions to Grassroots?
Well, this is a $5.5 million project. I think we're about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way there, and the rest of the way we really are relying on contributions from the community, and they can just get in touch with me at Grassroots. We really appreciate any contributions from any sector of the community.
Okay, and now we've got about a minute left, and Bill, I wanted to give you the last word. As you think ahead in this area, we haven't mentioned training much, and I think that's probably an oversight. Just speak with you, if you will, about the need for training of all the people involved in emergency response.
I think that's critical, only as good as we have practiced. And these are critical incidents, they're complex, and they do require preparation for it. And the training needs to start with small kind of tabletop exercises where we sit around the management supervisor staff and say how we would handle things. But it also needs to evolve into, well, okay, we bought a bunch of equipment now, we bought a bunch of Tyvek suits for officers. Can they get in them? How quickly can they? How long can they stay in them? So that real life application in a training mode to find out if the equipment is working, if the assumptions that we have made around the table and all this planning that Ryan's talked about, do they really hold up in the test? And then ultimately to go to full-scale exercises. And I know sometimes that can be a little disconcerting to the community because it's troubling sometimes to see, gee, why are they practicing? Well, they're practicing because something like this could happen, and we're much better off being prepared. And I just want to take 1 second to thank you. I mean, I travel a fair amount, and when I talk to my peers in other jurisdictions, other counties, how far ahead Howard County is among many others is really a tribute, not just within county. I mean, some places are surprised that police and fire talk, but we also talk to mental health, public works, all that we consider our first responder team. And then when I start talking about CERN, which you've heard mentioned, the Community Emergency Response Network, which you lead, I mean, that has just been a tremendous asset. It's a way to pull in, because government itself is not going to be able to handle all these problems when they arise. We need the community, we need the nonprofits, and your ability to pull all those folks together and really
Well,
have a
thank you.
concerted plan is that's been very, very helpful to us.
Okay, well, on that note, I appreciate that. I'd like to thank my guests, Ryan Miller, Bill McMahon, and Andrea Ingram, for being on the Horizon. We'll see you all next time. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.